Hello and welcome to WXVU Villanova's new series, So You Have a Podcast? I'm your host, Ryan Dery, and today I have the privilege to be joined by Matt Christman of Chapo Trap House. Matt, how are you today?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you for being here. I just want to take a quick moment to congratulate you on getting married recently. I hope married life is going well for you.
Thank you very much. It is.
Good to hear. Good to hear. So I mentioned that you are one of the hosts of Chapo Trap House. Could you give us a quick rundown of all the podcasts and media projects that you've been part of and a brief description for each?
Well, the main one is Chapo Trap House, which is a political comedy podcast that I've co-hosted with Felix Biederman and Will Menaker and Amber Frost at times, Virtual Texas at times for the past 6 years. I've also done a spin-off show called Hell of Presidents with our producer, Chris Wade, about American political history. And I'm preparing another one with him that's going to be available as sort of an adjunct of Chapo about early modern Europe called Hell on Earth that's going to be available in January.
Awesome. Thank you. So we're going to get right into it. So this first section is about mostly Chapo Trap House. So what were you personally doing immediately before the start of Chapo?
On the internet. I mean, that was kind of me. I have nothing to recommend me as a producer of anything in terms of life experience or anything like that. Just sort of a internet blob.
Nice. On Twitter a lot, I would assume.
Yes, exactly.
So what inspired you, Will Menaker and Felix Biederman, to start Chapo all the way back in 2016? And how did you come up with the name?
That was Will's idea. And he just said it sort of as a joke at the end of our first broadcast that was a test run. We just recorded ourselves on a Google Hangout. We didn't know how to edit anything. We just knew that if we put a Google Hangout on YouTube, you can rip the audio from that. And we just directly sent that out there just really to see if people thought it was good. People thought it was interesting. And we got a really strong response. So we kept doing it. The name was not something that any of us had really thought of. Will threw it out there at the end as sort of a joke because he is into hip hop. And then, once it kind of immediately got a response and we followed up and did some more, it was stuck. And we haven't had, it's been at times embarrassing, and I know a lot of people sometimes get offended by it because it's appropriative. But we part of the reason the show I think worked is that none of us really were thinking too hardly about what we were doing, and so it was able to have sort of an authentic and fresh feeling for people, and that was part of it.
Yeah, I definitely think a name like Chapo Trap House is better than any generic politics show name you could come up with.
Yeah, like the Politics Boys with a Z or something. It would not have been good if we'd had to sit down and try to think of one.
Yeah. So you have at various times sworn off predicting things for the future, but of the predictions that you made in the first year of the show in 2016, which did you get the most and least correct?
I don't remember really us predicting much. We were mostly just kind of yelling about the political scene and the lack of any reflection of our view on what was happening in any of the media that we were being confronted with, including stuff that was, supposed to be outside of the mainstream. And so we were really focused on just sort of providing some sort of counterpoint to that. We didn't really get into the prediction game until later, and that was not really ever my strong suit. I don't think that I mostly get everything wrong when I try to predict specific outcomes of events. I feel more confident in my grasp on like broader contours where things are going, maybe in a general direction. But I think there's just too much accumulated randomness and things moving at too high of a speed for there to be a lot to gain from predicting specific outcomes anymore.
So, on that note about the general contours, so what are the political and cultural contours and currents that you think the show has done the best job of exploring? And has the focus of the show changed at all over the years?
I mean, at first it emerged. The show started as uh, a part of the greater phenomenon of the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016, which gave a lot of people who had been really alienated from the Democratic Party and the Obama administration over the previous 8 years, and who wanted some sort of change of direction, a hope, and that they were not alone, and that there were other people who felt the same way, and enough of them to maybe push politics in a different direction. And I think that the first 4 years of the show, from the 2016 election to the 2020 election, were us articulating this alternative path for the Democratic Party that could be taken if enough people signed up and sort of did the work of overcoming the institutional barriers to that more left-wing, traditionally class-based approach to politics that the Democratic Party had extinguished over the previous 40 years. And then, after the 2020 election, we all had to sort of come to the realization that our understanding of where the center of gravity of American politics was, and specifically who was a self-conscious political actor in America, and the things that motivate people to become self-conscious political actors in this country, are just antithetical to conventional electoral political organizing at the national level. And so since then, the Brandon years has really been us trying to focus ourselves along commentary lines, trying to make points about what's going on, trying to, more than anything, be entertaining and funny about news of the week and about general American life, without the underlying premise that there is another track to follow that we are part of. Because after the failure of the Bernie campaign, there was this broad crisis among people who had supported it about what to do next. And the one thing that I noticed personally is that the instinct to sort of deny the evidence of the senses and double down or on pressuring the Democrats, or shifting to try to imagine that there's some sort of populist basis within the Republican Party, are pretty fruitless. And we wanted to sort of save ourselves from spiraling, basically, out of connection with reality. So I kind of feel that the purpose of the show now is to keep myself and our listeners sort of grounded in the reality of our lives, and to resist the siren call of political fantasies that are very, very seductive, considering how out of control and degrading everything feels.
Yeah, that note about people that have turned to the Republicans is very interesting. It seems to me that there's multiple factions of ostensibly left-wing people that are fighting over the most interesting way to vote Republican.
Yeah,
in 2024, which seems to be completely off the ball.
I mean, it's honest. If you want to see your enemies suffer, and if you have decided that liberals are the reason that we are in the state we're in, and liberals are who have denied are the ones who denied us the possibility of any kind of class politics, which in some senses is correct, then any outcome that sees them come to grief, sees them miserable, is something that at a libidinal level can be attractive. But beyond that, the idea that it can lead to a politics that is in any way different in its structural outcomes than the one we have is, I think, the real delusion.
Yeah. So now moving on to the Hell of Presidents podcasts. So what inspired you and Chris Wade to make this podcast, and why the presidents as sort of the entry point?
Basically because Chris had enjoyed and noted that when we're together, we're at a bar, we're hanging out, we're on tour in a hotel room or something, I can get wound up on specific presidents and I'll just start talking about them. And he just enjoyed those conversations, and he thought that they could be the basis, like my specific weird hyper fixation on presidential ephemera and personalities could be something we could hang a greater narrative of American political history on top of. And that's what we ended up trying to do. There were a number of permutations and plans for it that kind of weren't able to come together. The original idea was we were going to pick a few lesser known presidents to focus on, but it became a question of contextualizing everything around them. And we ended up just deciding to go all through them in order. And excuse me, that was sort of the original inspiration for it. Was, hey, wind Matt up and he'll holler about Martin Van Buren for 20 minutes. That might be fun to listen to.
So maybe picking up on Martin Van Buren, I know you think he is an underappreciated president in our history. Are there, maybe talking about him and any other presidents or eras you think are underappreciated in American history?
Well, yeah, Van Buren is definitely one of them. He's one of the one-term losers who, and he's from before the Civil War era, which that period between the founders and the Civil War, when the presidents are most obscure. It's then in the Gilded Age when the presidents are the mediocre presidents, as they're referred to in that Simpsons songs number. But he was probably the single most important individual in building the second party system that really has dominated American politics ever since the 1830s. The Whigs, of course, went away to be replaced by the Republicans, but the Democratic Party that Van Buren built, the alliance that he built between Northern laborers and Southern slave owners is one of the most important blocks of political influence in this country, and helped shape its destiny more than almost anything. And so I think he deserves more recognition for that, certainly. Other ones I would say who get kind of under remembered or underappreciated, Grover Cleveland is a pretty important character in solidifying the American state that emerges out of Reconstruction and the recurrent economic crises of the late 19th century, and helping to keep at bay a real populist challenge to the two-party system with his two non-consecutive terms. And Truman, honestly, is wildly underappreciated, considering how important the period of time that he was president for was to the formation of the post-war American state, which then became the administrator of the post-war global capitalist imperium that we're all now living in. So yeah, I'd say those guys.
Yeah, Truman's an interesting figure because he was a machine Democrat from the Pendergast machine.
Yeah, the Kansas City Pendergast machine. Yeah.
So
last president to not finish college.
Yeah. So, and that was a very close call, given that Henry Wallace was the vice president before in the FDR's previous term, and then I guess it must have been the Southern Democrats and the machine Democrats got Truman in there, right?
Yeah, there was essentially a revolt from the machine Democrats and the Southern Democrats at the convention in 44, when everyone sort of understood that FDR probably wouldn't finish his fourth term he was running for, that refused to renominate Henry Wallace, who was the representative of the left wing of the Democratic coalition that had just was winning World War II at that period. That went from everybody from the progressive academic types to the CIO-backed, fellow travelers, and that there was simply not enough. There was not enough juice there. The party was center of gravity was too fixed in its urban machines, and certainly in the Solid South, for a meaningful confrontation to be held there. And so they had Truman foisted upon them. And then when FDR dies at the incredibly crucial moment that he does, it ensures that the post-war state is going to pursue confrontation with the Soviet Union rather than any sort of cooperative rebuilding, which is something that the Soviets had great hopes for, and which many in the New Deal coalition and in the FDR's administration were hoping to at least attempt. And Truman's ascension wiped that out as a possibility.
So the broad coalition of the New Deal with the Dixiecrats, the Northern Machines, sort of urban liberals, is totally alien to our current ideologically based parties. What presidents best exemplify that change?
You mean from like the coalitions to the ideology? I mean, the big breakup occurs in the 70s because the economic engine and the of the Democratic Party, which was this relationship with big labor, begins to break up because big labor itself is essentially euthanized over the course of the 70s by the reaction to the stagflation crisis and the energy crisis of that period, when a globalized capitalism's contradictions start breaking up the post-war order that had sustained that New Deal Great Society coalition. But the real year, the presidential election that really sees these fractures emerge out of sort of latency and become completely dominant is 2000. So I guess you'd probably want to say George W. Bush more than anyone, because Reagan obviously comes in and makes great inroads with a lot of former Democratic voters in the South and in the white flight suburbs, the Reagan Democrats. But you still don't have a real that really doesn't hit like the levels of Congress until the 1994 presidential election. And Bill Clinton still wins West Virginia, both of his reelections handily. It was really the 2000 election where there was really no economic agenda at stake. I mean, it's hard to remember now, before 9/11, in the wake of 9/11 and everything, but the joke of the 2000 election is that they were basically identical candidates, in that they had no real vision. That neither of them had a compelling contrast with one another on any economic question. The Clintonite synthesis of Reaganism was the hegemonic vision of both parties. So it really did come down to personality and affect in a lot of ways. And those things end up after 2000 increasingly defining people's relationship to their presidential preferences.
Mm-hmm. So a common refrain during the whole of Hella Presidents was it's free real estate and
free real estate
and the role that the frontier played in American history. So how does the search for frontiers inform the current moment?
Well, you see the ceaseless seeking for frontiers in things like cryptocurrency and NFTs, metaverse, and when you see how just impoverished those concepts are, and how relatively few people are able to even briefly entertain any real hope that they're going to be able to be enriched by them in any way, culturally or economically. The legitimacy crisis that is now racking American political institutions really comes into focus, because America's political institutions are validated by the continued exploration and settlement of frontiers and distribution of frontier surpluses, not democratically, but in some sense broadly. And that has been replaced by this cannibalistic end stage capitalism, in which the consumer bonanza at the bottom, or the middle, rather, in the middle, the precarious middle of American population, has been replaced by a growing, gnawing precarity, and a sense that there will be less in the future, not just for you, but certainly for your children. And as a result of that, the assumed legitimacy of political institutions and political processes is now coming into significant question. And no one at any level of power in any of these institutions is capable of addressing it, because for them, they all still work. For them, they are all still as legitimate as they have ever been. And they can only respond with sort of bafflement and an attempt to batter people back into faith in the system that can no longer be sustained, because the frontier can no longer be imaginatively explored. The only people left who can get any broad center of the population to go along with their frontier fantasies are individual heroic billionaires like Elon Musk. But those visions are pure fraud and hucksterism, which has always been an engine of American political and economic progress. We say that America is built on free real estate, but specifically real estate scams. It's getting people to buy. It's giving people an idea that they will have total, that their wealth will be unlimited, that they can gain, and their children can gain sort of exponentially through a speculation on land. But the people who actually make money at every level of America's settlement are those who are selling the land to the people who are going to then find just how hard it is to actually live on it. Most of the Western settlement, the infilling of the land along the railroads that are put in after the Civil War, is a cycle of fundamentally fraudulent real estate speculative bubbles, and if complete with broadsides and advertising promising abundance in areas of the country where there's basically no real precipitation, and where farming is vastly more difficult than it is in more settled parts of the country, and drawing people out to find, to their own disappointment, exactly how hard it is to live out there. But at that point, the real money had already been made, and that continues now. The difference is that it's the only game in town, and even it is only pitching salvation to a very, very small percentage of the population who can fantasize about living in Mars or whatever, whereas everyone else has to reckon with the sober reality that the frontier for them has completely been foreclosed.
A great answer. And the final question in this section: is there anything that you learned that was surprising or unexpected in the course of doing your research for Hell of Presidents?
Surprising about it? I'm always amazed by just the depth of the violence of the labor movement, the late 19th century. It was by far the most turbulent and violent in the Western world, and the unanimous backing of capital at every point by the forces of government's alliance with capital in all of those conflicts is so naked and bracing that it's astounding that any common Americans could survive that time with any remaining faith in these institutions. But of course, it's also the exact same period that America's imperial project begins. And that's not a coincidence. Another thing that stands out in researching it is the role of the determining role of specie and of currency and of, before 1913, the gold standard in determining the rate of America's economic activity, and denying to common Americans any real control over their own lives, how they're going to interact with this hypothetical American abundance.
And that played a role in the ending of Reconstruction.
Yeah, like the insistence on the gold standard and hard money policies, more than any other single factor, more even than the racism of America's white population, is what dooms Reconstruction as a project, because there was relatively little actual reconstruction going on. There were titanic efforts by many of the Reconstruction governments to for the first time in the South create a civic infrastructure, but at every point they were hamstrung by the boom and bust cycle that the gold standard made inevitable, and which prevented any real stimulating economic investment, public economic investment in after the collapses that would inevitably occur cyclically.
Okay, now moving on to your forthcoming Hell on Earth podcast coming out this January. So what inspired you and Chris Wade to make Hell on Earth? How does it connect to Hell of Presidents?
Once again, it's Chris Wade's idea. And the premise is, we've talked in Hell of Presidents about the birth of the American state, the colossus that ended up bestriding the globe and determining the economic political trajectory of global politics in the 20th century and into the 21st. But like, that system does not have its origins in the United States. It has its origins in the Europe that people who the white settlers of America were coming from, and the system that they were bringing with them to the Americas was forged in the conflicts of the early modern era, and specifically the crisis of the 17th century, which saw continent-wide conflagration of revolts and revolutions, civil wars, and the 30 Years' War in Germany. And out of that tumult emerges this systemized alliance of all of these social and technological innovations that had been discrete phenomenon distributed throughout different parts of the continent, brought into control by the hyperactive middle classes of countries like the Netherlands and then England. And so we thought it would be good to kind of wind back the tape to examine exactly how that force emerges, to connect that story to the settlers who come to America, and then with free real estate, synthesize out many of the contradictions that made capitalism in Europe so cyclically violent, and made it capable of taking on that role once their violence had exhausted itself in the 20th century.
So picking up on one of those discrete innovations that went into this capitalist machine that was built at this time, the printing press totally changed the way that totally changed the access people had to books. From 1400 to 1450, there were between 20 and 30,000 manuscripts copied. But between 1450 and 1500, there were 20 million books printed. How does this change human social relationships and subjectivity?
It changes what it means to be human fundamentally, because humanity is always, no matter what capitalism has sort of trained us to believe at this late point, it is always a social construction. A human individual does not have coherent meaning outside of a social context. But what that social context meant in medieval Europe was a very intimate thing. It was the people that one interacted with, for the most part. It was those who you saw every day or every week. It was the people outside of that circle of commerce were in some sense alien and could not be really considered part of the same conceptual block as the more intimate relations. The creation of a literate public creates a new psychic concept of the self that encompasses people far outside of one's personal circle of relations, and that is insanely powerful, and it ruptures a lot of the settled modes of relation that had dominated European social life throughout the feudal period.
So, do you see social media playing a similar disruptive role today in changing how people relate to other people?
Yeah, absolutely. Like we are part of one of the theses of the show is that we are currently living through our own crisis of the 21st century, which is a mirror in many ways of the crisis of the 17th century, which was a situation where the demographic explosion post Black Death had helped lead to this efflorescence of new technologies, social, economic, cultural, but that new way of being, the new more urbanized, faster paced, more marketized lifestyle that was being lived increasingly in many precincts of Europe, specifically in Northern Europe, was not being matched by changes in the political structure, because those systems were still dominated by the old feudal lords, and there was no force capable of challenging that power in any other class. And this led to a real deadlock that was pushed out of balance and into opened catastrophic conflict, apocalyptic conflict, by a climate change, by the Little Ice Age, this period of intense cooling that occurs in the early 17th century that knocks the pins out from underneath the agricultural economy that this rickety system depended on. And in the struggle to survive this emergent crisis, elites are essentially forced to act against their own long-term interests, their long-term power, to hold on to near-term power. And that helps build this new system without anyone being aware that that's what they're doing, that then comes out of that conflict and through the competition between those medium-sized states of Western Europe, eventually becomes a global hegemonic structure, which we are now living at our own end crisis of. We are now at the same point with capitalism that Europe was globally, that capitalism was with feudalism in the early 17th century. And we are similarly having our system where new modes are being built while our political system is still dominated by an unchallengeable elite. And we are also having that stalemate interrupted by climate change brought on by the very system that emerged to respond to the last cycle of catastrophic climate change. And so social media is doing the same thing to our minds, making us no longer subjects in the same way we were, but still relating to each other through the same political and economic ways that we had before, the same way that the printing press did. And in a same way, it's having wildly unpredictable effects and destabilizing effects that cannot really be controlled or predicted. And the end result, I think, will be the same. Something is being built and something is going to emerge after or through this struggle that is going to be its own radical reformation of subjectivity, of the economy, of human life to deal with the new emergent reality that our ecological crisis point is going to insist upon.
And one of the ways that the people in the 17th century dealt with the changing reality was the development of Protestantism and Calvinism. So could you talk a little bit about why Protestantism, and really specifically Calvinism, is more amenable to capitalism and a more marketized existence?
Protestantism can accommodate the reality of market relations, that is, relations between strangers, whereas medieval Christianity, the medieval Catholic Church, was premised on a notion of universal Christendom and universal Christian citizenship broadly, and the reality of a community of believing Christians who had their faith reinforced ritually was that there were certain things that you could not do to your fellow Christians without violating fundamentally your brotherhood with them. And one of those is, something like charging money at interest. And one of the big reasons that Jews were sort of pariahs during this period is because while that sort of economic activity was necessary even for feudalism to operate, it could not be something that Christians could in good conscience carry out. And so subject populations, pariah populations, were sort of charged with that antisocial element of the economy. But by the 16th century, when Protestantism emerges, the option to maintain those relationships is being undermined by the increased speed and marketization of the economy, by the increased amount of just currency in circulation, the amount of money moving through Europe, thanks in large part to the colonial enterprises of the Spanish Empire. And in that context, there needed to be a new religious understanding of the self that could treat another as a stranger, and also could find a virtue in labor for its own sake. And I think Luther emerges really as a figure who is trying to save the feudal social structure from itself, who believed that a Bible reading evangelical population would, through their understanding of their own salvation through grace, treat each other as brothers without the need for the intercession of a corrupt hierarchical Catholic Church. But the gears moving were much deeper than that. They could not be stopped. And so within a generation, you have the emergence of Calvinism, which is a fully internalized conception of faith that no longer depends really on any sort of social validation. Yes, there's still church. You still go to sit with fellow believers in your congregation, but that congregation should be separate in its hierarchies and powers from the state as such. And even the Eucharist, should you carry out the ritual of that, there is no more real presence there. Like even for Luther, who questioned the sacraments of the Catholic Church, he's broke it with the Calvinists over the question of the Eucharist. He refused to believe that there was no presence in the Eucharist. He believed, as a fundamentally medieval subject, that if you gather enough believers in a room, that God shows up, in the form of the bread and the wine. But for Calvin and those who came later, that is literally inconceivable. Their rationalized faith insists that even when you get everybody in the congregation in the prayer room, that it stays bread and it stays blood, that there is no kindling into another world. It's a colder world that Calvin imagines. And it's not a world that Calvinism imposes. Calvinism is rather a way that people who are being forced into these new relationships are able to make sense of them.
Very good answer. So how does Calvinism go on to transform into secular liberalism?
So it's the breach, the secular liberalism, you can trace its origins in Calvinism in the Armenian disputes in the Dutch Republic during the 80 Years' War. So the Dutch embraced Calvinism very fervently, but by the early 17th century, after the big truce of 1609 in the 80 Years' War with their Spanish overlords in their fight for independence, by which point the United Provinces of the Northern Netherlands have been able to create a de facto independent republic, while still holding out hope that they could also liberate the southern Netherlands, which is now Belgium, which at the time was still being dominated by Spain. And this figure, this theologian, Arminius, he called himself, emerges with a theology that attempts to soften the harsh predestination of Orthodox Calvinism and suggests that there is some requirement of works to leaven, the life of faith, that you can't, as the Calvinists imagined, live a godless life, basically, of pursuit of profit, of pursuit of domination, because these godly Dutch are at this very moment literally building the modern slave trade in the Atlantic, while fighting the Spanish. There's more overwhelming obligations of a Christian, and that conflict leads to the decapitation of the peace party during the truce period, and the domination by the war party, which the House of Orange, the army, and the Orthodox Calvinists. But Arminianism ends up becoming the underlying faith of Methodism, and then eventually American liberalism, because it is a rational faith. And as time progresses, rational belief in God's existence becomes harder and harder to sustain. But the need to belong to some moral order, and the need for a person to embody some moral virtue does not go away. And it is transformed into a political ethic of virtue propagation, which then becomes the basis for the American New England liberal tradition, and by now the whole the Democratic Party broadly.
Yeah, I think you can see that transformation in the social basis for a lot of the social movements in America. In the early stages of America, a lot of them were religiously grounded. Like a lot of the abolitionists were very religiously grounded, but by the time you get to the progressive era, like evangelical Christianity had sort of been left to the rubes, essentially.
Yes, yeah, because once that split comes to America, and it manifests between the people who actually are at the spear point of capitalism and the brutal accumulative process of building American capitalism, the slave owning class, the Scotch-Irish Cossacks, basically, who guard the frontier and do the most direct conflict with the native populations, and the people who are safe in merchant houses in New England, dealing with the economy as an abstract, non-confrontational form, who are able to imagine themselves separate from these brutal realities of imposing the market on North America, and so are able to invest in rituals of political self-abnegation, where they prove their virtue and their worthiness of holding money by their willingness to try to reform America's political and economic institutions in a more morally a more, it's not egalitarian, just a more morally,
Virtuous?
yeah, virtue is the word. A politics of public virtue, let's call it that, which is something that, you know, those who are doing the dirty work of building capitalism in America are fundamentally alien from. And that conflict really has defined American politics ever since. For a while, there was a self-conscious working class that influenced that conflict, and that created sort of a third pole in American political identity. But we've been living for at least the last 40 years in the aftermath of its defeat. And so now politics is completely dominated by what is essentially a nervous breakdown within the middle class American mind over these questions.
So turning back for our last question to the 30 Years' War, what role did the Rosicrucians play in the 30 Years' War? And how do you think occult practices figure into class rule generally?
So there's in the early 1600s, there are these pamphlets that emerge anonymously written in Germany that allege the existence of this secret society of very learned, wise men living in a city of light who use essentially proto-scientific, alchemical, Kabbalistic practices to bring about the thing that pretty much everyone in European is hoping for, which is the return of Christ, but not in a biblical religious sense, but in a social sense, that it will be brought about by the collective knowledge of the people of Europe, and that that fight, it necessitates the overthrow of the tyrannical, superstitious Catholic Church, which is refusing to allow for a public sphere of intellectual engagement to exist, that, you know, burns books, burns heretics, and that must be defeated, and that must be defeated by a champion of reason and of godliness. And many people in Germany became convinced that the figure that they were referring to was Frederick V, the Elector Palatinate, who was the only Calvinist elector in the Holy Roman Empire, the founder of the Protestant Union, which is a military alliance within the Holy Roman Empire that sought to advance Protestant interests against a emperor that they increasingly saw as on the side of the Catholic powers of the empire, as opposed to a neutral arbiter. And as a result, there was a fervor in the Palatine capital of Heidelberg for this apocalyptic confrontation, because there was a belief that effort had these secret chiefs working behind the scenes on its behalf, and that it was therefore sort of blessed, and that helped contribute to the decision, which was looked upon at the time by many, including Frederick's own father-in-law, the King of England and Scotland, James I, with horror. But interestingly enough, even though there were no Rosicrucians to actually exist, and the provenance of the pamphlets has never really been established, there's a chance that they were part of some broader intelligence operation to try to propagandize towards the Palatinate efforts that sparked the 30 Years' War, the decision to take the crown of Bohemia from the rebels who refused to give it to the Holy Roman Emperor. But in the aftermath of that, people who had read the Rosicrucian manifestos, began to build their own actual societies modeled on what they'd read, with the hope that they would by making those efforts, come into contact or be contacted by the real Rosicrucians. And it sort of manifested into reality the thing that was only being fantasized about in the pamphlets. And many of the people who ended up founding the the Royal Science Academy in England, that is a fulcrum for a lot of the technological scientific progress that fuels the Industrial Revolution later, were people who'd been influenced by those Rosicrucian currents. For the broader question of occult societies and class systems, the argument has been made, and I find it sympathetic, that the origin of permanent class rule can be found in secret societies. That it is that systems that are fluid in their authority in the prehistorical moments when relative abundance of land and resources makes it very difficult to impose centralized authority on people who don't want it. Those systems become concrete. The systems of like temporary surplus extraction for the purposes of festivals and solidarity building can become permanent features of extraction due to certain groups of people with mastery over symbolic language and systems of belief, turning them towards the specific narrow interests, material interests of people within that group, at the expense of the broader population within under the symbolic umbrella that they operate in.
Very interesting. So this last section, these questions have been sourced from the r/acid Marxism subreddit, which is a subreddit dedicated to your vlogs. So a few people were interested in the role that psychedelics play in building a spiritual understanding of the world. In your view, what are the uses and limits of psychedelics? And you've often described them as a shortcut to feelings of oneness. What would be the long route?
Well, the long route is contemplation, is stillness, is mastery over the senses. But that is something that is very, very difficult to embrace if you are, enmeshed in human affairs. There's a reason that historically people who have sought that goal are able to live off of the surplus of others and really not have to worry themselves with they either systemically live off of the surplus of others in monasteries, or they live as hermits away from society and simplify their interactions so that the distractions and overwhelming emotional forces, the pull, the tug of life enmeshed with other humans, are sort of paired away. So that makes it very difficult, and that's why people find themselves so trapped within the matrix of relationships that they find themselves in, especially since so much of the things that we do every day are not things that we would choose to do. That we feel broadly compelled to do them by our lack of self-sustenance, by the fact that we cannot live off the land in any meaningful sense, that we are at the mercy of systems of economic exchange that we have to participate in. And so psychedelics have been something that can sort of cut through that and allow for the state of mind, the awareness that could come only otherwise through like very tenacious and deep commitment to rigorous like mystical practice. They can essentially simulate the mental state, the degree of the speed of the mind of someone who has mastered their senses through that process. But that makes it a double-edged sword, because it does give this awareness that can break you free very rapidly and miraculously from systems of thought that had completely dominated you and that you thought were absolutely transcendable. A door in like the seeming coffin of life flies open, but for that reason, it's also dangerous because sustaining that new belief is very difficult if your conditions are not changing. And so the temptation is to just continue hitting that button. But because you are not willing those perceptible changes into existence, controlling them is very, very difficult. And at a certain point, you can remake reality around you, but then you will come into contact with other people who have not had their reality remade the same way. And if you cannot live with, if you cannot compromise with those people, then you break with reality in a way that sort of inevitably leads to some sort of violent conflict with the world around you.
Yeah, good answer. So another question was that the defeat of the Bernie campaign led to the various insights of being grill pilled and a lot of the early movements in the vlogs, but that phase seems like it has reaching its sort of life cycle. So in your eyes, what happens next? And another very common question that kind of ties into this, are you still planning on writing a book that synthesizes the ideas you've been exploring in the vlogs?
Well, that question is difficult, and it's kind of they kind of connect to each other because, like, yeah, the original idea was, okay, what do we do now? The Bernie failed, pandemic happened, like the iron gates are closed. How do we deal with that? And the answer that I realized I needed to hear for myself, and then I kind of articulated to others, is like, I have to stop investing emotionally in the political process the way that I had, because my level of control of it is so much less than my level of emotional investment in it that I am essentially slaves to it. I am a slave to this process now because I have no impact. I have no influence on it, and yet it has total influence on my own state of mind. And so I had to set about a way to frame and redefine my relationship with the spectacular politics that I had been consumed by till that point. The problem, though, for a next step is that if you have emotionally detached from the spectacular politics, if you do believe that if you do accept your own lack of influence and power over them, that means that the question of what to do with your time and emotion is one that can only be answered individually. Because if the question is, what can I control? Therefore, what can I feel like I can influence? What can give me a shape to my life, and what can give me a sense of direction and the security of control, the sense of centeredness that comes from having a goal that can be pursued. All of those things that can fill that hole, by definition, cannot be proscribed from a central perspective, because the only frame of reference that someone in my position can have for others is the generalized spectacular level, because that's the only thing that's the only thing that we're all seeing at the same time. And what that is that which by definition we can't control, by definition we can't influence. So that becomes this contradiction at the heart of my project that I'm just sort of having to live with. And the way that I personally am dealing with it is by doing more historical stuff. So I don't honestly know if I'm ever going to write anything that synthesizes the political arguments that I've been making. But I do think that I will probably write a lot more about history. And I am probably going to take a lot of the stuff, the material from the Hell of Earth the Hell on Earth podcast and try to translate it into another format, and also take it, into different directions from there.
All right. So we are about at an hour, but if you have a few more minutes, I have a few kind of lightning round questions for you.
Yeah, sure, go for it.
All right. So is your day going more Apollonian or Dionysian?
Ha! I try to have both. I try to mix it up, like the girl in the taco commercial. Hard shell, soft shell, Dionysian, Apollonian. I try to mix it up. I try to do a little. I definitely tend towards more the Apollonian, that even when I'm trying to have fun, it's kind of hard sometimes to let go. But I'm trying to do both.
Nice. So why do you start singing? Why do you start the vlogs by doing a little song?
It's because it takes a while for people to start funneling in, and I don't just want to stare at the screen like a dope, I guess.
I guess that's a good way to fill the air.
Yeah.
So what is your favorite place in Wisconsin?
I like Milwaukee a lot. I mean, it's got its problems. It's got a lot of problems, but I also lived there for a number of years, and I think it's got a lot of character and a lot of cool stuff about it. Yeah, that's probably my favorite place.
It's in a similar vein for this question. You've lived on the East Coast, West Coast, and third coast of the Great Lakes. How are they different and similar in your eyes?
Well, the thing is, in America, like, everything's basically the same. I mean, that's
Yeah.
the whole point, is that the culture machine sort of smooths away everything that might be differential between them. I do think that that Midwest nice is a thing, although it is mostly very deep, very barely restrained rage most of the time. Whereas, like, the East Coast is a more confrontational personal style that is, I think, probably in some ways healthier, because it is an expression of feeling as opposed to a repression of feeling. And then California really does live up to its reputation as a place where sort of you don't have that conflict, because nobody's really feeling anything, just sort of a comfortable numbness.
Nice. So what is your favorite nonfiction, or not your favorite, but what is one of your favorite nonfiction books that you would recommend to someone to read?
One book that I read a while ago that really gave me a lot of inspiration to sort of think in sort of really big historical terms, and to, like, try to make broad connections in a way that, like, academic history really frowns on, is The Cousins Wars by Kevin Phillips, which is this magisterial work that makes a broad argument that the English Civil War, the American Revolutionary War, and the American Civil War is a extension of one long conflict between the landed elites and merchant elites in the Atlantic Anglosphere, and it's got a lot of really cool details and fascinating anecdotes, and also really interesting large scale history telling. Oh, another one, Big Trouble by J. Anthony Lucas, which is about the trial of Big Bill Haywood for the assassination of the former governor of Idaho. And that book is really great and has its own idiosyncratic approach to history, in that it sort of takes the trial and uses it as this opportunity to take these wild digressions on all sorts of topics. So when describing the people coming to Boise for the trial and staying at the local hotel, he gives a history of like railroad hotels in the West, and these huge sort of mini cities that are built up very quickly in these boom towns in the West that have, like, in these ridiculous amenities. I still remember reading that. He goes into a description of the detective literature of the period in relation to the Pinkertons, who abducted Big Bill Haywood and his co-defendants and illegally crossed state lines with them. So it definitely is a book that helped influence my approach to history, in that it reminds you of just anywhere you look at any seemingly clear, seemingly straightforward historical moment, there's just these fascinating nodes within them that you can choose to dial in on with what you're interested in.
So similar question. Do you have any fiction books that loom large for you?
The collected works of George Saunders. He's probably my favorite living American author. Mostly short stories, one novel called Lincoln and the Bardo. They're all great. He's got a new one out that's got maybe his best work in it. He's got a short story there called Liberation Day that I think synthesizes a lot of things he'd done in previous works, and creates a kind of a new thing, even though he does work in a few recognizable modes. It's fascinating if you read all of his stuff, just seeing him make variations on similar themes and still find new insights and beautiful juxtapositions and poetry in all of them.
Thank you. And what movies do you think have had the biggest impact on you and have gone the most into your brain space?
Well, I mean, I was a child of the 90s. So I had my brain just absolutely pulverized by Quentin Tarantino when he showed up on the scene. So yeah, Reservoir, probably for good and definitely for ill as well. But you know, I didn't choose it. I can't do anything about it. So definitely Tarantino. Also, Dr. Strangelove is a movie that I saw as a teenager and had really got under my skin.
Yeah, great movie. And so the last question I have is, do you have any games on your phone?
Not anymore. For a while, I was downloading a bunch of those. I was cycling through those ones you see on like Instagram ads where it's like you're running on a path and you're like trying to get
bigger or more guys.
Yeah, but they're never actually what they look like in the ads. And then I get bored pretty quickly and I delete them. And I'm now like, no, get out of it. The only game I have on my phone right now is Twitter.
Yeah. Yep. All right. So that is all I have. Thank you for joining us today.
Yes, thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Have a good rest of your day.